Hello my friends, as usual, don't forget to subscribe and your opinion matters to me in the comments. Okay, let's begin. Rain was falling heavily over the roofs of Cleveland, as if the sky were trying to wash away the sins that had accumulated in the alleys over decades. His intelligence exceeded expectations, but something mysterious broke inside him one night. His mother, a religious woman, was assassinated in her apartment in an unsolved murder, and the killer left a single phrase on the wall in her blood. The trunk does not lie. He went up to his attic, closed the windows tightly, and took out an old wooden box from his closet, labeled Mother's Legacy. Inside were yellowed files containing documents the police had never investigated. Reports of charred bodies, children missing without a trace, an unidentified bediesel within a single time frame. 30 days after each appearance of a severed torso, there, in the basement of a dilapidated building, sat Edward Malcolm Hayes, sifting through forensic books like a miner through desert rocks. His moral compass shifted, and his life became a futile journey to understand the message left by the mysterious killer. He knew that what he had considered a mere academic study had now turned into a personal haunting. He had to reopen the trunk killer case not as a historian, but as someone who lived within the story itself. Houses of Silence and the Sounds of Roots. He spent years pursuing crime files involving where the torso was left alone, without the head or limbs. He began building his own archive, storing photographs, reports, and newspaper clippings, some from the 1940s and 1950s, all of which shared one detail: a surgically severed torso left in public, as if in protest against humanity. When he arrived, he felt as though he had entered a frozen region, outside the bounds of time. The barren trees, the decaying wooden huts, everything screaming that life had abandoned the place, except for one hut. Only soft music filtered through the receiver, an old melody from the opera Carmen. They spoke of the purity of the body when separated from desire, of the arts of alternative creation from the roots, and of the head and limbs being unnecessary confusion. The author described himself as a dissecting priest, and wrote as if he were revising his own Bible, and the soothing music of Bacha emanated from it. Edward entered to find an old table covered with many notebooks, each bearing a single title on the cover. In the background a child's laughter sounded, and then the call disappeared. He called a lab in town to develop the photos the next night. When he got them, there were 6 pictures. One autumn night in 1983, a package arrived in the mail without a return address. Inside was a photograph of a human torso, carefully dissected and stitched with bright red medical thread. The feeling of being watched loomed over him like a thick fog, through which he could only see the shadows of faceless questions. Of him now, standing in front of the hut, taken just hours ago. The torso severed with sharp instruments, no signs of sexual assault, no fingerprints on the body side. A tall man wearing a medical shirt, holding a book. He didn't speak, he just looked at him, smiled, and then disappeared. He'd never thought he was real ... until now. Only a trace of strange mud. The scattered trunks do not form a tree. He was testing him. He regained consciousness, sweating, his hands trembling over the black notebook on which he had spent the previous nights mapping the victims, rearranging the dots to finally reveal the figure of a headless, limbless human. A voice that promised to lead him to the roots of the story. With each new clue he found, the sense grew that there was a mesh of memory and place intersecting, leaving no opportunity unattended. Preparing for the next victim. In old crime records, he found a neglected note about an abandoned family home near the Cleveland River, where a small autopsy room had been flooded behind the wall. There, the assigned coroner recorded a crime in which a woman's torso had been severed and encased in cement 40 years earlier, then buried beneath the floor. He took a deep breath and continued searching until he spotted a small crystal staircase hidden beneath a pile of pipes. Here, where the threads of the map he had drawn on the wall of his apartment converged, the points of the trunks finally translated into a single location, an abandoned niche beneath the bridge, hidden behind rusty tin sheets. In his pocket, his black notebook teemed with pages stained with ancient cemetery ink, recording the names of victims and the measurements between the thoracic vertebrae. The staircase looked like an old doctor's chest. He opened it, and inside was a rusted tape recorder. Each step creaked like a muffled cry. Slowly, he dropped his hand to the shell of a small, hidden button as he dusted the walls of a crude sculpture, chiseled trunks and roots twisting into a gaunt humanoid. In the middle of the scene, an ancient inscription read in dry letters, "Here is born," criticism of the authenticity of the body. He didn't hesitate. He pressed the button, and the drawer opened to reveal an iron staircase ascending downward, to a depth never before trodden by human feet. Edward flinched when he smelled the stench of decay mixed with the paved raindrops. His fear was triggered by the echo of a threshold folding behind him. When he reached the end, he found himself inside a narrow crypt. Its floor was lined with layers of cracked cement, and beside it were stone shelves studded with skulls exposed to the air, connected by iron bars, as if they were trunks suspended for a gruesome display. He advanced, bewildered, until he spotted a small wooden box on a lower shelf, decorated with a spiral engraving. The box was locked with a lock that rarely made an unpleasant creak in these tomb-like depths. He tried to open it carefully, then his notebook clicked. The keys he'd found lying in a distant corner of the crypt. They looked like keys to an old police department. He turned the lock shakily, and the lid lifted. Inside, a mask resembling an old surgical helmet, coated in pale gold foil, with the interlocking letters E engraved on the forehead. Edward moved so close he almost accidentally broke it. At that moment, heavy footsteps rose behind him. He turned, finding a tall shadow behind which stood a row of perfectly arranged logs. He hadn't expected to see them, but he had no idea that inside hid someone similar to himself. A thin man, his face half covered with tattoos resembling red tree trunks, in his hands wearing medical gloves stained with dried blood. The voice said in a sickly calm, "Welcome to the heart of the tree, heir to the axe and the hammer." Edward barely caught his breath, and his mind raced as he remembered the first Killer's message. "You were trembling before your mother's corpse. You looked like me." As the voice took a few steps forward, the dim lights from its lamps combined to reveal the features of the real killer. A pale copy of Edward himself, a double projector generating a wooden humanoid form, as if the mirror had remained alive and reproduced. A calm and exhausted fragment of a single corpse. The other Edward smiled a pale smile, then lifted the golden mask to reveal a bare skull with bones soaked with the blood of kinship and anger. "No, the real," Edward cried to himself. "I'm not the torso killer." The shadow laughed echoingly, as if emerging from the depths of an eternal crypt. "But you were illuminating my map on the wall. You made me from your evidence. The little god you carved with your own hands." The two exchanged brief, harsh glances. Then Edward leaped to his feet, using his metal lamp as a cane. "This doesn't end the story," he shouted at the shadow. "The tree stump will fall here." The blood exploded as he realized the crypt was rising toward a dim light, a small opening through which threads of morning sunlight filtered. The two rushed toward it, and a violent struggle ensued on the stairs. The lamps shattered, the iron bars holding the skulls rattled, and the vision turned into a varnished nightmare. When Edward emerged into the daylight, he found the golden mask in his hand, and the other shadow had disappeared into the depths of the embankment. He calmly went to the riverbank and threw the mask into the water. The water immediately calmed, as if he had stirred a dead tree buried at the bottom of the river. Edward was no longer adept at awakening shadows. He took out his black notebook and jotted down the final line. "The trunks fell, but the heads survived. The truth will be revealed when man discovers his dark roots." Since that day, the trunk killer ceased to be a single legend, but rather a living tale passed down by investigators and researchers, warning them that evil lurks in the depths of the soul where the roots of illusions grow. The end, he hurriedly played it, hearing light footsteps and the sigh of a tall man, then a whisper. "You're no longer alone, Edward. This is where we all meet." The tape recorder fell from his hand, gasping, the repressed pounding in his chest slapping his head with relentless questions. He left the house, waving his arm in alarm, then drove out of the city toward the artificial island marked on the map. When he arrived, the scene was like something out of an architectural nightmare: crumbling sidewalks, steel containers stacked in corners, and dim lampposts that concealed more than they revealed. He walked barefoot through the warehouses, until he spotted a rusty door emblazoned with an overlapping E&M, a symbolic inscription that stood out like a personal seal. He pushed open the door carefully, and entered a dark hallway, the walls littered with autopsy panels of unknown heads and torsos. Beneath the panels lay a piece of grey stone, carved with the date 1980s and a tiny signature, E.M. Hayes. His blood froze. It was his own signature, but he hadn't created it. He sat in front of the panel in utter confusion, his mind racked with one question: am I the heir, or the latest victim of the stump tree? Suddenly, his cell phone rang. It was an unlisted number, but one he had imprinted on his memory. The number of the first attacker, who had sliced open his victim's torso 40 years earlier. He answered, trembling, and the voice on the other end said with terrifying calm, You put the map on the wall, but you really don't want to see the whole picture. You have two options: to rage in your research, or to choose silence before you collapse. He ended the call before asking more and began to feel the edge of the map he held in his hands. He realized for the first time that the man called the Trunk Killer had hidden his final masterpiece here, in this iron container. What had yet to be discovered was how to gather those scattered roots and transform them into a complete human tree. He returned to his car, confronted by the ghosts of the recent and distant past. Before him lay hundreds of sites he had recorded on his map, and 1,000 branches waiting to be connected to others. He knew that every point on the ground was a scream yet to be heard, and that on the final stretch of the journey, he would have to dig beneath the concrete until he reached the dark source of water. The origin of life that had committed suicide under the axe of storytelling. The carved heart of the tree, no one knew the number. He answered hesitantly, and the voice came from the depths of a graveyard. He arrived at the mid-rise building, its broken windows looking like dead eyes staring at him with contempt. He climbed to the basement, the creaking of the old staircase announcing his presence. He quickly found a rusty door leading to a small room scrawled with ink symbols on the walls, overlapping circles, Roman numerals, and the phrase, "The torso is the origin of creation." He analyzed an old sample from the crime scene and discovered a surprise. The mud contained a rare plant species that only grew near deserted northern lakes outside the city, specifically in the South Erie belt. He had now entered an area without a map, and when you walk in the dark without light, sound becomes your only guide. On top of the map, the Torso Killer had drawn a severed head surmounted by an iron bridge archway. Beside it was written. His inner voice cried out at every moment, "This killer doesn't leave bodies. He leaves messages." In the background, a sign for an abandoned train station west of the city could be seen. It wasn't a new image. It dated back to the 1935 crime from the era of the legendary serial killer who would later be called the Torso Killer. But what was suspicious was that this version of the photo contained a previously unpublished angle, and the viewing angle suggested that the photographer was standing at a high elevation, perhaps a metal bridge. Edward's heart raced as he flipped through the image. A man in his 50s with a rigid expression. He worked restoring old criminal documents for the National Archives, but no one knew that his interests were not merely professional. In his youth he had been enrolled as one of the brightest anatomy students at the University of Pennsylvania. From that moment on, Edward was no longer the same. Is there someone still tracking these crimes? Has the crime been repeated in the present, or is someone playing with the killer's language? He didn't wait long. He began drawing a map on the wall, black lines connecting each crime site. He quickly recognized a recurring pattern. The starting point was always somewhere low-end. The body pointed northwest. It was like an artistic signature, as if the killer were playing a piece of flesh, blood, and a compass. Then the phone rang. An unknown number. The caller didn't speak. He didn't sleep a wink that night. For days, Edward Malcolm Hayes couldn't sleep. Edward continued to investigate the file, which had been neglected for 30 years. The victim was unidentified. There, the journey began. He drove his old car through the frost tour with the lake area, relying on the hand-carried map he had received earlier. Its door was ajar. The Torso Notebook. The Remaking of Man. He turned the pages. They were philosophical texts, written in quasi-religious language. Then he found a marginal note that made his heart stop for a moment. "I saw you once, Edward. You were trembling before your mother's corpse. You looked like me." That confession unlocked the tattered lock of his memory. On the day his mother was killed, there was a shadow in the corridor. In the corner of the room, he found an old camera with undeveloped film. 3 of mutilated bodies. There was no longer any doubt. The killer wasn't just watching him. On his way home, he received a call on an abandoned landline in his car. "You're halfway there, Edward. Now you must choose. Do you tell the story, or do you become part of it?" The line went dead. He sat in his rocking chair all night, staring at the map. Only now did he understand the true pattern. They formed the shape of a human, a body without a head or limbs. A maze of illusions and voices beneath the concrete. Edward Malcolm Hayes awoke to a strange dream. He saw himself standing amid a pile of human torsos covering the floor of an abandoned hall, the only complete torso wrapped in black tape, guarded by a stubborn shadow. Days had passed since his last contact with this invisible voice. Edward decided to visit the house despite the dire warnings he'd heard from the neighborhood resident. Amid the dust of torn books and yellowing notebooks, he found an old leather map showing the course of the river leading to an abandoned artificial island in the middle of the city. Remove the head of the mystery, and you will find the tree at the bottom of the water. The door slammed shut behind him with a sudden force, and the room was filled with the echo of footsteps moving away from him. As dawn broke and the sky softened its blackness, Edward Malcolm Hayes stood before a rickety iron bridge that hugged the banks of the Cleveland River. He advanced into the pitch-black darkness, using his flashlight to reveal a stone staircase held by a rusty hinge.